So if you've seen my other videos, you probably know already that I'm not a big fan of the most common type of AAA game being made today. The huge open-world sandbox with crafting mechanics, hundreds of side quests, and basically no interesting story or unique mechanics to speak of. Which is unfortunate, because that's usually the genre that big studios break out for new IP. The rest of their output tends to be sequels, remakes of decades-old dinosaurs, or, worst of all, brain-dead co-branded mobile games. Well, geez, Cinnamon, I hear you saying. If you don't like anything the major studios are putting out these days, then what the hell do you like? The answer to that question is indie studios. Yacht Club Games, Team Cherry, Pixel, Toby Fox, kind of. Derek Yu, Studio MDHR. These are some of the most creative people to ever work in the games industry, and they're practically overflowing with good ideas. Unlike the AAA studios, they haven't been afraid to experiment with unfamiliar, unpopular, and risky ideas, and their games often have a refreshing simplicity that sets them off to advantage against the clunky, over-designed colossi produced by their corporate competitors. I can hardly wait to see what these studios move on to next. The only problem is, I'm not sure if they are moving on. Toby Fox spent 3 years making 1/6 of a sequel to Undertale, which he basically admits he might never finish. Yacht Club Studios has made nothing but DLC for Shovel Knight over the half a decade since their big hit came out. Excellent DLC, mind you, but still DLC. Team Cherry decided to take the Hornet campaign from Hollow Knight and make a full-fledged sequel out of it, which is like more Hollow Knight, yay, but nothing totally new from them for the next several years. And I have no idea what Pixel and Derek Yu have been doing for the last half a decade, living under a rock maybe. Unfortunately, even the most creative indie studios of today seem increasingly like one-hit wonders, building their legacy on a single mega-popular game, instead of continuing the innovation that made them successful in the first place. Today we're going to examine the indie one-hit wonders, how they got to where they are, why they aren't growing and changing, and their future in the video game industry. Assuming they have one. Because the thing is, while one-hit wonders are fun and interesting at first, they can get real old and real boring really fast. Now maybe you don't think this is such a big problem. Surely I'm overstating the case. After all, the examples I mentioned are just a few of the popular indie titles that have come out over the last decade. There can't be that many indie studios with only one hit to show for their years of work, right? Ha ha ha. Roll the tape. Dodge Roll. These guys made Enter the Gungeon 3 years ago, and that's it. They already have merch after a single game. Not that I can complain too much, because this little guy is adorable. Relogic. These guys haven't had a hit since Terraria in 2011. 4 years later, they took a stab at a new IP and whiffed completely, and it's been radio silence for the last 3 years. Thomas Happ. This guy's like the Boston of video games. He makes one game every 7 years, and it's great. Unfortunately, this probably also means he should never make more than 2 games. And I'm not done yet. Even the studios who have managed to make more than one popular game have often found themselves stuck in a rut, especially over the last 5 years. Just look at Edmund McMillen. This guy had 2 hits in 2 years, and then nothing for the next 6. And then he released a Super Meat Boy clone. Just fantastic. Playdead. They made Limbo, then spent half a decade making Limbo in color. Haven't done anything else in 9 years. And have I mentioned they have 40 employees? Cellar Door Studios. I feel bad for them. Had a big hit with Rogue Legacy, then tried to branch out with Fullmetal Furies and just tanked. Shows them for doing something different, I guess. I think I've made my point. This isn't a fluke. While it's far from universal, this is a common pattern of stagnation that indie studios these days tend to fall into, sometimes accidentally, but often deliberately. Why would any small studio choose to spend all its time reworking its one big hit instead of trying to make new hits? Well, regrettably, there are a lot of limitations and incentives that push indie studios in this direction. To begin with, one of the biggest problems is that indie studios are, well, small. One of the greatest things about modern technology is how it's democratized the creation of art. You don't have to be a programming genius to make a video game anymore. If you want proof of that, just look at Undertale, made by a total novice using the game design equivalent of Microsoft Paint. However, there's a dark side to this influx of small, inexperienced developers into the industry. It takes them a long time to make anything. Sure, a single person can now make a video game, but at the end of the day, it's just one person doing all the complicated things that go into a game. It's shocking just how few people are involved with making many hit indie games today. Undertale, Axiom Verge, and Minecraft were largely made by a single person. Super Meat Boy had 2, and Team Cherry's Hollow Knight a whopping 3. So we can see that these tiny studios have a lot on their plate when it comes to finishing even their first game. Who could possibly expect them to make several at the same time? But in spite of these limitations, many of these studios have managed to make games within a reasonable time frame. It didn't take Toby Fox a decade to make Undertale, and Team Meat released 2 super popular games within a year of each other. What's more, it often seems like more time passes after the hit comes out these days than it took to make the game to begin with. So why aren't the studios announcing new projects during all that time? Well, here's one possible explanation. What have these developers been doing since they finished their first big hit? Well, in many cases, they've been continuing to make the big hit, or at least remake it. Games like Minecraft, Terraria, and Stardew Valley feature open-ended gameplay, and have been supported with patches and new content pretty much since they came out. That eats up a lot of the developers' time and makes it harder to branch out. They're treating their biggest game as a service, and that requires dedicated staff. Not the easiest thing to do when you're a small company. Then we have games like Shovel Knight, which are technically straightforward experiences, but have had a truckload of associated DLC and content updates. These were more or less imposed on Yacht Club games as Kickstarter stretch goals, but I don't think anyone can deny they've gone much farther with them than any reasonable player could have demanded. Unsurprisingly, the most recent bit of DLC was treated as a standalone campaign, with a separate price tag. If not for that, Yacht Club would have seen no profit from a year and a half of work. Hollow Knight was similarly burdened by backer expectations, but like Yacht Club, they went a little crazy trying to meet them. For instance, backers reached a stretch goal to make a second character playable in Hollow Knight. Team Cherry looked at that goal and decided, what the hell, let's make a full-fledged sequel featuring the character instead. The enormous presence of these single hits, not just in terms of profitability, but also the amount of effort spent on refining, polishing, and porting them, casts a shadow over the rest of the studio's potential output. Trying to work on other games ends up being a lot like trying to grow flowers under a massive tree. The established success just sucks up all the sunlight and nutrients, and after a while, the tree is all that's left. Okay, you may be saying at this point, so it's difficult for small developers to move on from a big hit. But obviously they want to move on, right? I mean, these are creative people. That's why they got into video games in the first place. They must have more than one good idea for a game, right? That's what I thought at first. But then I realized something. The strictest limitation on indie game studios isn't their size or their circumstances. It's their attitude. One thing all these studios have in common is the enormous, world-shattering success of their one big hit. By putting that money into their businesses, hiring more people, and expanding from a small studio to a mid-sized one, they could easily meet all the obligations of their existing franchises while continuing to make new ones. There's just one problem. They don't want to. Toby Fox is a perfect example. This is a guy who made millions of dollars from sales of Undertale, far more than he would need to buy office space, hire a few programmers, and set up shop as a professional game developer. If he had done that 2 years ago, Deltarune would probably be finished by now, and he would be moving on to greener pastures. But the thing is, Toby Fox loves Undertale, and the process by which he created it. He's an auteur, and an amateur, and that's clearly how he likes things. The instant he puts other people to work on a sequel to Undertale, it's not totally his project anymore. He's also never been responsible for managing other people's work before, and he probably doesn't want to be. Making a game himself, with minimal help from a few friends, is his ideal, even if it means the game takes a decade and looks and feels exactly like his last game. I think a lot of indie developers are like Toby Fox. They're makers, not managers, and the thought of turning into a different kind of studio worries them. Because of this, they're sitting on their profits rather than using them to expand. Indie studios are full to bursting with creative ideas for game design. What they lack is organizational skill and the willingness to direct talent instead of being the talent. When I think back to the medium-sized independent developers of previous decades, I remember studios that produced a wide variety of different games. Think of Rareware, Capcom, Atlas, Konami, Maxis, and LucasArts. These studios were never pinned down to one style of game, and they used their success to bring strange and fun ideas to life. Even with the proliferation of indie studios in recent years, I can't help but shake the feeling that the industry overall is less innovative and more derivative than it used to be. The absence of mid-sized studios has a lot to do with that. The older ones either grew into large studios, got bought out, or went broke. And because modern indie studios want to stay small, there aren't many new ones emerging. We need more people like Rare's Stamper Brothers, who knew that managing a game studio was an important part of making games, and that they could let other people design their games without losing the qualities that made them special. This leaves customers with a taste for variety in a tough situation. We're caught between AAA studios who have no incentive to innovate, and indie studios who can't afford to, or who won't even when they can. That's just fine if you like sequels and DLC, but just like one-hit wonders, you'd be surprised how fast sequels can get stale. I'm really hoping that these developers don't stagnate and end up being defined by one monolithic property. There's still time for them to branch out, but to do that they have to let themselves grow. I'd love to see the next big thing from Yacht Club Games. What I don't feel like seeing is the latest Shovel Knight campaign from the people who brought you Shovel Knight. Things aren't quite as doom and gloom as I'm making them seem here. While many of the most prominent indie studios are one-hit wonders right now, a lot of my favorite games come from studios that are threading the needle between tiny indie studio and gargantuan corporate monstrosity. I'd like to end this video with a brief tribute to them and their efforts. Ludosity. This Swedish developer is just wonderful. They made the Zelda-like It'll Do, a hilarious riff on Smash Brothers called Smash City, and one of my favorite freeware games of recent years, the pixel shooter Princess Remedy in a World of Hurt. D-Pad Studio. These guys made Owlboy in 2016, and 2 new games since then. I'm particularly impressed by them because Owlboy took a really long time to make, but they haven't let that slow them down. Lucas Pope. He works completely alone, but he refuses to be pigeonholed into one game genre, and already has 2 big hits to his credit. Amazing guy. Clay Entertainment. A relatively small studio, but these Canadians are responsible for Don't Starve, Mark of the Ninja, Invisible Ink, and several other projects. I really have to admire these guys for continuing to develop new game projects, even while supporting Don't Starve with fairly substantial DLC. Fishing Cactus. This Belgian studio made a lot of mobile games, as well as one of the most unique PC games I've ever played, Epistory Typing Chronicles, an adventure game where you fight bugs and solve puzzles by typing. I also feel that I should point out that they talk about how their business is run on their website. That's the kind of thing I'm looking for. Way Forward. This California studio is practically an old-timer by modern standards. They made a Game Boy Color game, for Christ's sake. But even though Shantae is their most successful series, they've always made side titles and never seemed totally dependent on their one-hit franchise. In a better world, these guys would be a lot more well-known. And of course, last but not least, Concept, whose games are so gloriously wonderful that they make me cry like an anime fan on prom night.